The Philadelphia Eagles will now be without both their offensive and defensive coordinators in 2023. What is the replacement plan? We'll get into that and more on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. I'm Louis DiBiase. He's Gino Camilleri. Today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Then this game is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the App Store. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDON in all caps, LOCKEDON. In the game. If you're new to Locked On Eagles, we're your only daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, including the offseason. And Gino, unfortunately, this offseason starts in a sad way without a Super Bowl ring after Sunday's loss. We're still kind of going through the pains of that loss. We dove deep into it on Monday and Tuesday's show, but we do have to move forward, and the news really just starts instantly. I mean, we got catapulted right into the offseason because, as we heard yesterday, breaking news in the morning and the afternoon, both offensive coordinator Shane Steichen and defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon, they're both now head coaches. Steichen is now the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. Gannon is the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. Your overall thoughts, man, just first on both of those guys departing. Don't think it's super surprising. They've been both gaining interest over the last 2 years, but I guess it just comes with the territory of being a great team.
It's fitting that the first time and the first season we did this show, we lost Frank Reich to the Indianapolis Colts.
Yeah.
They didn't lose their defensive coordinator, but this time around they did. And they lose Shane Steichen, funny enough, to the Indianapolis Colts, and they lose Jonathan Gannon.
I'm surprised they wanted to dive right back into the Eagles coordinator bucket.
It is,
especially with the whole Sirianni thing after that game.
As somebody who's so superstitious, I would not delve back into that pool personally. But good for Shane Steichen.
Yeah, great coach.
Good for the Eagles and Jonathan Gannon, let's say. I think it's going to be harder to part with Shane Steichen than it is Jonathan Gannon. Because if you look back at it, and our friends over at Locked On Cardinals wanted us to give some talking points, and I think you and I are on the same wavelength that he had a lot of pieces in the big moments where you're saying, yeah, these elite players just need to be put in a position. The game plan has to be good enough to put you in just one situation to win a football game. How many times did we see that over the last 2 years where even good to better quarterbacks got the best of Jonathan Gannon's defense with premier talent, Lou? So it's going to take them a while, I feel, in Arizona to get going on the defensive side of the ball. But it will be interesting to see how they turn around. How is Nick Sirianni going to respond? Because Doug Pederson, one of the ultimate downfalls of him was not replacing Frank Reich. It was going to Mike Groh and bringing in Press Taylor. And those guys just didn't seem to hit home with what was going on in the quarterback room. Carson Wentz didn't have somebody there with John DeFilippo and Frank Reich to get him right. And you saw what happened to the downfall. Inevitably, everybody was gone from that team in 2020. And Nick Sirianni comes in now, and he has to hopefully expand his own tree. Hats off to him, though, Lou. Within 2 years, he's got 2 guys in head coaching positions, so he nailed it the first go around.
And like you said, it is crucial this point in time, replacing those coaches, and it really did hurt Doug and the overall team after 2017. I mean, how many times in 2018, 2019, 2020, although I didn't totally agree with it, there were points of, man, this team misses John DeFilippo, this team misses Frank Reich. So, that's, again, just par for the course, though, when you're a consistent Super Bowl contender. I also think it also has to do with the players just not being good enough after that year. And this roster, I have a lot more confidence in. And I think this roster kind of carried Jonathan Gannon. And Gino, we mentioned on the show yesterday, and I didn't really give the best ringing endorsement of Gannon for Cardinals fans. And I think some Arizona fans didn't like that and got a little upset, probably because they were trying to get excited about their head coach. And I kind of crapped all over it. And then our boy Alex Clancy over with Locked On Cardinals kind of reiterated what I said and said, look, this is concerning for sure. And I think for The Indianapolis Colts, I think they're getting a great offensive mind in Shane Steichen.
Mm-hmm.
I thought he helped Jalen Hurts' development a lot over the last 2 years. For Arizona, yeah, I'm sorry. I could not imagine being a Cardinals fan and believing that Kyler Murray and Jonathan Gannon are the two staples that are going to win me a Lombardi trophy. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, and this isn't a revisionist history thing. I mean, somebody said to Alex, and he was like, "Oh, look at their past shows. They've spoke highly of him, and now they're trashing him on the way out." No,
that's the number one ranked defense in almost every category, and we were yelling about this guy.
Yeah, no, the last 2 years, if you've heard us talk about Jonathan Gannon,
this is not the Jonathan Gannon podcast.
I said this, Lou, and I'm going to stand by it. Jonathan Gannon, like Jim Harbaugh said about Ryan Day with Ohio State, Jonathan Gannon was born on third base. He was given everything as a coordinator. What more could you have wanted? We gave him a year, right? We gave him the year to give him all the excuses. He didn't have his personnel. Then his personnel comes in. Yes, he ranked highly in all these statistical categories, but if you look back situationally, and that's what we always have preached, situationally, Jonathan Gannon is susceptible to good or better quarterbacks, and he fails to game plan against offensive-minded coaches who, in Andy Reid and some of the better coaches that they've played in the last, even Kellen Moore has gotten the best of a guy like Jonathan Gannon. I wouldn't be able to find any confidence in him being my head coach. I didn't even want him to be the defensive coordinator, but now we have to figure out who is going to take this talent with probably a lot less than they had this year and get the best out of it, because you're going to have the foundational pillars. You'll have the Hassan Riddicks of the world. You'll have the Milton Williams, the Jordan Davis, the Josh Sweat. You'll probably re-sign Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, one of the linebackers, one of the cornerbacks, Avonte Maddox, but it's not going to be the beast that it was last year. Who can maximize that talent moving forward?
And I think they're going to want to keep things close to the same philosophically on defense. Definitely. And, because like you mentioned, they have a lot of talented defensive players that some are free agents and they're going to try to re-sign, like Javon Hargrave, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, but you're going to have some like James Bradbury leave, and, Marcus Epps is a free agent, both linebackers, TJ Edwards and Kazir White. There's a lot of unknowns about the future of this unit. But at the same time, there are a lot of players intact that will be back next year. And I think they had a lot of success this year. So I don't think they want to throw everything out completely and totally change up, going from like a Billy Davis defense to Jim Schwartz and then Jim Schwartz to Jonathan Gannon. At the same time, though, I would love a guy that's just more intricate when it comes to contextualizing his defense based on matchups that are coming up. I want a guy maybe that's a little more aggressive and more matchup based. I don't know who that is. I know defensive backs coach Denard Wilson is a really big time candidate on the inside, but then you've heard rumors about guys like Vance Joseph, and you look across the league. I think they would have loved Vic Fangio if he was available, right? It would have been a seamless transition since he was a consultant all year. Of course, we know he's in Miami, so I don't know who the replacement is going to be, and I know it's not going to be completely a 180 from Gannon, but I would like somebody that, again, like you mentioned, is just better at getting this defense ready for different matchups.
I would have to agree. And does Denard Wilson trust his corners and the system that you're going to employ to be, like you had said, Lou, because he comes from the Jonathan Gannon tree? Is he going to be very similar to Jonathan Gannon, to where when you were going from 2017 to 2018, it was like there were no outside voices coming into that offense, so everything was relatively the same, and teams had figured it out. So is Denard Wilson going to adapt? Because that has to be the thing. He has to change the Jonathan Gannon paradigm, which got them there in the first place and limited what their ceiling ultimately was. Yeah, maybe they had a pretty high floor, but when it mattered the most and you needed to knock that ceiling out of the park, you clearly saw what the
It's a tough balancing act, Gino, because in 2020, I think there were too many cooks in the kitchen from the outside coming in from Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie, and that hurt too. So I think it's a balancing act. And again, like I said, that's why I think they're going to want to bring in a guy that, even if he's in-house, that's going to keep things a lot the same as Jonathan Gannon, because you had a really good defense last year, but at the same time, there were flaws in Gannon that me and you were concerned about. It showed up in the biggest moment in the Super Bowl. And with our next coordinator, I think we'd like a change in that way for sure. We'll continue to get into these coaching topics, Gino, as both Steichen and Gannon are on the outs. The Eagles need 2 coordinators in 2023. We'll get into that and more on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles. And guys, today's show is sponsored by Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this mobile game app for months, and I can't tell you how much fun we had throughout the season competing with our fellow Locked On NFL hosts. Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers was our Locked On NFL champion. Well, now it's your turn to compete, but more on that later. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Well, your dream can come true, and this game is definitely for you. You'll manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through seasons, and lead your team to glory trying to build a dynasty. With Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of a season, all in this challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free, and playable offline. Play on the go as you want to, when you want to. We've created a Locked On League. Like I said, it's been so much fun. Get your family and friends involved. Locked On Eagles listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in the game store. It's all caps, Locked On, LOCKEDON. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM, start your dynasty today. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. It's a Wednesday edition of the show. Gino Camilleri, Louis DiBiase, we are diving into the news that Jonathan Gannon is out. He's the new head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. Shane Steichen is out. He's the new head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. And Gino, we really focus more on Gannon in that first segment, how we both look, this defense was great last year, for sure. The majority of the time, they're number 1 in turnovers and sacks and, passing yards per game. And against the run, they got better down the stretch. Like, this was a great unit full of talent in all 3 levels. But at the same time, we had concerns about Gannon going back to the beginning of 2021. And we were confirmed that our doubts were true. And it came true in the Super Bowl, unfortunately. So I think we both agreed that this forced change, because the Eagles didn't want this, but it happening to them, I think is going to be for the best. When it comes to Steichen, it stinks. I actually think Steichen was a really good coach. I think having him in Jalen Hurts' ear the last 2 years and having a consistent play caller for the first time since Jalen's been in high school was very beneficial. But at the same time, you've got Jalen, who's not going to get complacent, even if Brian Johnson's his guy, but this isn't going to be a Wentz Press Taylor thing. They're both going to hold each other accountable. He's always going to improve. I think Brian Johnson's a great mind, and, Nick Sirianni's an offensive-minded head coach. So I think things are going to stay consistent on this side of the ball. So I'm not overly concerned. I think Brian Johnson's a perfect replacement for Steichen.
I think you had figured out exactly what makes Jalen Hurts tick. And I think unlike the defensive side of the ball, where maybe bringing in an outside mind that might challenge some of the ways that they go about presenting their scheme would be optimistic. But on the offensive side of the ball, I think Brian Johnson is the easiest thing on earth. It's putting a square peg in a square hole.
I think he's going to be a head coaching candidate by the end of 2023.
Absolutely. There had been discussions that he should be in those conversations already.
I'm surprised somebody tried to pull an Eagles, get him a year early like we did with Sirianni.
Yes, definitely so, before everybody else finds out that he's a Shane Steichen.
Right.
And the thing that I fear ultimately with these guys that are around top-level quarterbacks is that sometimes it ultimately hasn't worked out for the best, right? You look at the Mike Groh, the Press Taylors of the world. You look at the Nathaniel Hackett's, the Adam Gases, right? I would just worry about that with Brian Johnson. But Brian Johnson has called plays at Florida. When he was at Florida, he was the offensive coordinator. He did call plays for them. So that's one of the things that if you're questioning, is he going to come in here with no experience? No, he has done that in the past at a high level, playing in the SEC, calling plays for an offense. It's a lot bigger stage when you're doing it in Philadelphia with Jalen Hurts, but he has known Jalen Hurts since he's 4 years old. If you want to talk about that interpersonal relationship to where they would challenge them both mentally and I would say physically, like what are the limits of what Jalen Hurts could do? Who know him better than Brian Johnson, who has known him forever? And I think Brian, like you said, Lou, is going to be probably the next guy in the Sirianni tree to get a head coaching job, I would say, after that season, because like you said, could have team already have done that this year? Absolutely so. And I don't think many people would have batted an eye. But now you have to figure out who's that next group that we're going to bring in here and mold, because that could be an inevitability if you continue this stretch of success that you have seen over the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, and again, it's always tough if you're going to lose your play caller every year, and that's just the reality. If you have an MVP caliber quarterback, teams are going to pick from your coaching staff all the time. So, that part's tough. Sirianni doesn't call plays, so consistently that's part of why I don't like hiring a defensive head coach, because then constantly the offense is ever changing to a certain degree. But at the same time, just because Sirianni doesn't call plays, though, this is his offense, and things will stay pretty consistent in that way. Whereas you look at, I talk about the Buffalo Bills a lot because I covered them in Buffalo, and you look at when they lost Brian Dable going to Ken Dorsey, you saw, because Sean McDermott's their head coach, a defensive mind, their play calling this year was completely different. And I think it really held their offense back. I'm not concerned about that going from Steichen to Brian Johnson. You mentioned if anybody knows what Jalen Hurts does best, it's Brian Johnson. He's known him since he was a little kid. And I think some Eagles fans might get a little concerned because they're like, here we go, a buddy system like Wentz and Press Taylor. But the difference again is Jalen Hurts is not Carson Wentz. Brian Johnson is not Press Taylor. They're going to hold each other's feet to the fire. And that's what this team, I think, does really well. Even if they're close, like A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts, they still butt heads, right? And they hold each other accountable. So I'm definitely not concerned about that part of the story at all.
I would say that if there's anybody that you trust to find a way through the adversity, it's this quarterback that had done it for you the last 2 years and clearly has everybody else bought in. So you're going to have to find a way to adapt. That's the reality of the National Football League. It's not just an Eagles thing. It happens everywhere. Look at the Rams of late. They've lost just about everybody from their organization over the last couple seasons. It happens when there is success. It just now not facing the same demons that you did going into 2018 and beyond when you failed to find somebody. Because if you do fail, it has to be a quick turnaround, and you can't stay stationary and just say, okay, we're happy with a decrease in points. Let's say your 30-point performances take a dip and that goes in half, and Jalen Hurts, let's say his accuracy numbers drop. Is there a correlation between the two? So you have to say who's going to be the best candidate, one, to lead the offense, and two, who is going to be the best person to work with Jalen Hurts. I think Brian Johnson is so seamless that it almost makes too much sense in this case, to where Press Taylor, it was like, yeah, you can see why they did promote him into that position, and Mike Groh, it made a lot of sense with him working with the wide receivers. But I just think if you were going to go about it out of that group, you would probably have wanted John DeFilippo to be the guy moving forward. Unfortunately,
and then
wasn't.
He moves on.
Yeah, exactly.
And, again, this is important for sure. And we saw it with Jalen Hurts. He finally has the same, offensive minds in the locker room with his play calling. And he's an MVP candidate after 2021, just being an average passer. But at the same time, the other thing, too, is Steichen said it himself at his press conference with the Colts. It's about the players. It'll always be about the players. And from 2018 to 2020, I think we were zoomed in on those coaching decisions, too, because this team, you had to rely on that more because the players weren't nearly as good and the good ones were always hurting. So that's what's going to make it easier for the next play caller. And Brian Johnson is he's got Jalen Hurts. He's got an elite offensive line. He's got A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Miles Sanders, maybe. We'll see what happens with that. So that's the thing, too, though, is you still got to focus on this offensive core. The coaches are moving, but these players aren't going anywhere. That was the difference is after 2017, it wasn't only the coaches were ever changing, but there were new players in and out of the lineup on offense every single week, including quarterback.
That's fair. That's 100% fair. And you have to say, looking back at the leadership style of Carson Wentz and what else they had around him, they've set Jalen up way more successfully than they did with that offense. And I mean, hats off to Howie Roseman, who we have to trust to continue this thing moving forward. Lou, it's like we forget that they have 2 top 30 draft picks this year that should be an instant impact. With the $20+ million bump in the salary cap, they're going to be able to keep pieces. And the one thing that got them there was depth. So hopefully some of those depth pieces can come forward with the continuity in the coaching staff to know those guys, those Milton Williams, the Patrick Johnson type pieces. I mean, if you look at the offense, how are you going to get the best out of maybe those 3 tight ends if you don't bring another one in there? How are you going to replace Isaac Seumalo Well, the coaches that are in-house, they might have a plan already in place to get those guys to succeed.
Yeah, Gino, change is going to come in the NFL. That's the reality, especially when you're really good. But I think the Eagles are a lot better set up to handle that change compared to last time they were in the Super Bowl. We'll get into that specific topic coming up next. Got some thoughts there. This is the Locked On Eagles podcast, the Wednesday edition of the show. Louis DiBiase and Gino Camilleri.
This episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. The NFL season is over, and they're at the midway point of the NBA season. So now is a perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back on your first bet if it doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel app on your cellular device or go to FanDuel.com/lockedon today and put in a money line wager, a spread wager. You could bet on player rebounds, assists, steals. You can win 2, 3, 4 times your money. I mean, you can win a countless amount. If you ever go on Twitter at any time and just look at people betting parlays on FanDuel, they're always just handing out money to people that put in bets responsibly. So go today to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bet. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA and the entire Locked On Podcast Network.
This is the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louis DiBiase. He's Gino Camilleri. We're getting into the changes of the offseason that are already coming for the Eagles. Jonathan Gannon, now the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. Shane Steichen, the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. Again, Gino, as we mentioned at the end of segment 2, this is just the reality when you're going to be a top-tier contender and you have an MVP quarterback and you make a Super Bowl. Change is going to come. Change is going to come in the NFL no matter what. And this is the moment now where we say, okay, can things change compared to last time? Because last time, there's been a million times the Eagles have rebuilt in a very short time frame to perfection, to surge up the standings and become a powerhouse. It's really, since the early 2000s, they've been a consistent winner in the 2010s, but it's never really come through the same core of coaches and players. It's been really off the backs of a complete collapse and then a total rebuild to surge them back up. It's happened with Andy Reid, Chip Kelly, Doug Pederson, now Nick Sirianni. So this is the true test now is, okay, Howie Roseman, you're the executive of the year. You've always been a master of rebuilds. Here's the time where in the past he struggled. I'm not doubting him at all. I think this team is beautifully set up for the future compared to last time, but these are the times where things get tougher on Nick Sirianni. As you mentioned, Doug Pederson struggled to pick the right coaches. Howie struggled to maintain that core, make the right decisions, add new complementary pieces, young players. The players failed to stay healthy and continue where they left off in 2017. This is the part now where you really find out if this team can be more than just a one-year wonder, a team that struggles to be great, or if they're going to consistently now with ease be a top team.
Well, you have to look at how that team was set up too, because it wasn't just like you were trying to replace, let's say, like a Marcus Epps, for example, or let's say TJ Edwards is out of town. Well, you have a Nakobe Dean that you had drafted that's just sitting there, and you have the Jordan Davises of the world.
Yeah.
And you didn't have a lot of those young core pieces. Like, who is your promising young core back then?
No,
Derek
the
Barnett.
drafts were too bad. You didn't have anybody.
Was Derek Barnett like your best piece at that point to sit there and say, oh, this is the guy we have to lean on moving forward? And yes, you had your young offensive line, but you could still now look at the Cam Jurgens of the world that will be able to come in and replace them there. And Jordan Mailata, you have an assurance there after the Jason Peters left. So a lot of those core pieces that you were going to have to replace after that 2017 season, and a lot of them that took a dip. Look at the Alshon Jeffrey, who he never was the same player he was in 2017. And same with Nelson Aguilar. And you lose Torrey Smith, you're never able to replace him. They're just set up right now that the foundation is more set than it was back then, to where the point
for sure
that Howie Roseman is starting is higher, in my opinion. And he just has to nail a couple more areas. And I believe that with his change in the philosophy of how he has constructed a roster in terms of the free agency pool, in terms of the draft, how he's nailed the draft over the last couple seasons. And you just have to expect him to know that he's got to hit on that 10 overall pick. He has to find a way to probably add more picks with number 30 and just culminate more and more depth, because the depth when it comes to this team always finds a way to get on the field, because the coaches that they've put in place have done a fantastic job developing the talent within this system. And you just hope that bringing in another coach that will keep the continuity on both sides of the ball will also go hand in hand in player development, because you don't get the Josh Sweats of the world. You don't get the Isaac Seyamalus without the coaches that they have in that building. So you just have to trust Howie to bring in the guys, trust the coaches to put them in a position to succeed, and trust the core guys there to continue to feed into this winning mentality.
For sure. And like you said, they're way better set up this time. A lot of their core is young and under contract. The guys that aren't, that are free agents, again, this is the time Howie's got to pick the right guys to re-sign. That's the thing. It felt like after 2017, every move he made in free agency just didn't work. Every move he made in the draft to replace those guys didn't work out. But lately, he's been killing the draft. He's been making the right calls with trades and free agency. So you got to trust that he'll make the right call on who to re-sign, and whoever he lets go, that he can replace those players. That corner he's going to have to draft to replace James Bradbury. Whoever that safety is going to be, let's say if you can't keep both CGJ and Epps, who's going to replace Isaac Seyamalus? So that was the part of this team that they really struggled. They just struggled to sustain success in it, because it gets harder, Gino. Of course, it gets a lot harder when your quarterback gets a mega deal and coaches are leaving and players go and cash in free agency. It gets a lot tougher. But that's definitely the part that I think things fell apart. And so right now, though, I'm feeling a lot more confident that they've learned from those lessons and they're already set up to be okay. And I think they're going to continue to add this offseason even more to make sure that's the case.
You would have to believe that guy who has taken advantage of market inefficiencies over the last couple of years is going to continue to do that. And look at how he was able to add Chauncey Gardner-Johnson right before the season had started. So, yeah, it's going to take a little bit. And this is the first step in the right direction to building what you would hope is a window that is at least 5 years minimum with this team that you have, with this core group that is under 30. Moving forward, how are you going to replace them? Well, it's identifying the long-term guys, those guys like Cam Jurgens, the Jordan Davises, that fit exactly what went well for you in this season, and hopefully you can try and replicate that moving forward. A lot easier said than done, though.
And got to remember too, all of these factors went into the downfall of the last team and have helped bring this team up. But you also got to remember, just having a 24-year-old elite quarterback is going to sustain that window a lot longer. You just didn't have that. Carson Wentz couldn't sustain that, didn't become that guy for a lot of reasons. And all these guys were playing a part in that. But that's another thing, is having a 24-year-old quarterback that is elite is going to help that window as well.
Not coming off of a ACL tear as
well.
Exactly.
With no serious injuries, and just the sky's the limit. So that's a
you should never question
the main part.
Never question the mentality of Jalen Hurts opposed to
that's why we're confident. That's why we're confident with the coaching changes and with the changes that are going to come this offseason for sure. And as you mentioned, they've got a lot of cap space, draft picks, and they've got flexibility for sure to make sure this team doesn't go down after an incredibly historic season in 2022. We'll continue to get into it. Got a whole offseason to preview. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Eagles Monday through Friday, all podcast platforms, and on YouTube as well. And we're always talking birds on Twitter. Hit us up at Locked On Birds, at GC24_football, and at DiBiase LOE. Thanks for making Locked On Eagles your first listen every day. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening. And let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.